So there you are, How Not to Write a Novel by Vincent Olivier. Hello and welcome to The Man Who Kept Dying. You're joining me in the studio. It's a creative room we have as part of the property, and we're very lucky to have completely recreate, because it was a bit in a derelict state and certainly not what it looks today. So sometimes I do record videos in that room. As you can see, there are some musical instruments in the background, and it's a very good place because, yes, as you can see, you've got direct views on the garden, and this is where we welcome our friends too. So anyone who's staying at home at our place, basically you've got your own room and this is where you get to stay. I'm very excited about this particular video, and for one specific reason. It is because as I get to do this video about how not to write a book, it means that I've covered all the chapters I wanted to talk to you about or to share insights with you about. So it means that I will be able for myself to move into a different type of content. We will talk about that later. But thank you as usual. You know the novel, The Man Who Kept Dying. The idea behind this video is to really give you, as you know, you've been watching all those videos, and I guess if you've been like watching all the videos about the chapters in depth, too, you will have some knowledge about some of the content of the chapters and the story behind that. I just thought that I would that I would record a video in which I explain how I wrote the novel. Bearing in mind, I'm not a full-time writer. It's never been my career. I'm coming from a completely different background. So perhaps we should start with a few very points to clear if you were having any questions about those, or if you have not, I've mentioned it in a few interviews, but you may not have stumbled across those interviews or watched them yet. So first things first, The Man Who Kept Dying. What awaits us when we die, Vincent Olivier, or in English, Vincent Olivier. It is a pen name. It's not my real name. My first name is Vincent, or Vincent in English. The name Olivier actually comes from my great-grandfather. And the reason why I decided not to publish under my own name is a simple reason of the line of work I'm doing, so more of my professional career. I wanted to distinguish my artistic activities from my professional ones. Not to say that this is not a professional activity, because you have to, declare the money you're making, and it's attached to my own business in a way, so it's a line of revenue separate from the rest of the business, but attached to the same overall business. So there still is a notion of that, but it's a very different idea. So whenever I'm doing something artistic, I'm happy to sign with Vincent Olivier. And why the name of my great-grandfather? Great-grandfather on my maternal side too. The reason for that is because he is the only person I have known from that generation. And when I was a kid, I was a bit afraid of him. And not because he was not a nice person, far from it, but he looked quite old, and I was very young. Like, I think he passed away when I was 5 years old maximum, so I still have memories of interacting with him. And I was a bit like impressed by his presence. He was very tall for his generation, and he used to, when he was retired, he used to paint a lot, do oil paintings and so on. But when he was young, he was actually a goalie, so playing football or soccer in the US, and being a goalkeeper. So very interesting life too, very nice man, very always smiling. And I remember one thing, like when I was very young, one day he was sitting on a sofa and he indicated to me to come to him, and I was a bit shy. I was like, what does he want? Because he never really plays with me. And he gave me a bit of money, like a note, and probably something around like the value of 5 francs at the time. And I didn't know what to do with it, because I was like, that's not a toy, I'm not going to play with it, what is it for? And he explained to me that with that, I could go and, buy some sweets or go to the local pastry and buy something, and it was on him, or I could just keep it for later when I fancied something. Basically, he explained to me the concept of money, which I had no idea about, or before that. So I still have that memory about him, and he offered me my first backpack as I was going to school when I was like 5 years old or something like that. So I remember his property in Brittany. I have memories like that. That's the reason why I picked his name. And quite interestingly, I found it more fitting as an artist name too. Because writers to me are artist people. Not that I am not a full-time writer, so you get to see an artistic side of me. It is my first novel too, so I had no prior experience into the business of writing a novel. However, I always knew that one day I would be writing a book. It is something that I've mentioned in several interviews, and again in the introduction of the book, or more precisely, the four words of the book. I do mention that indeed, when I was a teenager, I had this idea that one day I would be writing a book. For some reason, I knew that this book would be inspired from events from my own life, and don't take it as something preposterous. It's just one of those things that gets in your mind and you know about it, like an intuition. And I had always imagined that it would happen when I'm much, much older, because I would have to have lived a lot in order to be writing a book, and I thought it would be a sort of autobiography. However, as I explained, life sometimes has other plans. And in 2019, following my near-death experience, the idea really came to mind to write a novel, and following also a hypnosis QHHT experience, it was confirmed to me that I've got no reason to wait until I'm retired to write this novel. I could start now. So for the timeline, I started to write a novel in August of 2019. I had no idea how to write a novel. I had just read a PDF that was explaining 20 tips in order to write a good novel and to be a good writer. I'm not good with words, I'll be honest with you. Like, it may appear that I've got good communication and I've really upped my game with YouTube in a sense that nowadays I barely prepare any video. I can just sit behind a camera, press record, and I know what I'm going to be talking about. I guess practice makes you more confident. But when it came to the book, I had no idea. Nobody in my family has ever written a book, so I don't know anyone who's an author or a writer, and I had no one to turn to. But as I often do in life, I just went into it happy-go-lucky and see what happens. So the way I wrote it is absolutely unstructured. I had no idea about who the main characters would be, about sort of the plot and the storyline, so the skeleton of the book itself. I didn't start with that. I wanted to first know what it was like to write long chapters, and I had no idea about the volumes of the book, how many pages I would end up with. I just went with the flow. And the first flow was, well, the best chapters you can write right now, if you don't really have a plot, are the chapters for which you have a life experience to share. So you can draw from that life experience and write a chapter from it, or derive a chapter from it. The chapter can be like 99% the same, or it can be slightly different. So very quickly the idea went, I had to decide, am I going to sort of talk about my life and my NDE and do a more serious book about life, or am I going for a fiction? And I really went into write those first chapters about life, and then you will see what it tells you. So quickly, the decision was made that it would be a novel, it would be a fiction. It would not be like a book in which I'm sort of telling my life story already, which perhaps or probably is a good thing, because it gave me a lot more freedom and flexibility to play with the story and to really sort of like create it as I went along or as I progressed with the plot. The first chapter I wrote was chapter 10, The Doppelganger, on which I recently did a chapter in-depth video. I started with this one. I could have started with other chapters. Basically, I jotted down on a piece of paper different chapters inspired by my life stories that I could include. And actually, there are some that I've not included in the book, and I actually wrote them. But I decided in the end they would not be part of the book. So I wrote those chapters in no particular order, and I still remember being off at one point in Spain and having a couple of weeks off, and just like writing in the evening or in the afternoon, and really just be inspired by the flow. One thing that has never happened to me as I wrote this novel was to go completely blank. I always had the inspiration to write. Whenever I was writing, I would write. Bear in mind, I had a full-time job, so it was really an exercise that I would do in my free time. I managed at the time to strike a deal with the company I was working for. In a sense, without going into details, I had done some additional certifications in relation to my job, and instead of choosing a pay rise, I chose to have more free time. So instead of working 5 days a week, I decided to go for working 4 days a week and sort of like financially still be stable. But with that extra 3 day a week, I would spend it writing the novel. So very diligently, every week, that day, I would dedicate hours just writing the book. Of course, that was just before COVID. When COVID happened, life changed a bit around that. And I still had my job, throughout COVID. But the difference is I did not have to commute, so I had a bit more time in the evening. So even in the evening, if I was inspired, I would continue writing about the book. So that's it, starting with quite an unstructured way of going about it and ending up with a storyline that was starting to take shape as I was writing all those chapters. So once I'd written all the chapters inspired from real life events, the idea kind of came together about having a bit of a mysterious start to the novel where you're following, as a reader, of course you have a bit more insight than the main character, but you're following something that you're not really understanding perhaps, or I hope I did a good job of making it appear like so, that there's a bit of a mystery, as to why Mika, the main character, finds himself in what seems to be kidnapped or trapped by mysterious beings that know him, but he doesn't remember them, until of course they very gently and slowly open the door to his memory, and he gets to be reacquainted with the metaphysical side, realizes that actually is passed over or is hovering between life and death, and gets to meet his spirit guides and so on. As I explained in the video about the spirit guides, even for the spirit guides, I had not even defined who they were. Some of them just came along as I was writing the story. Interestingly, as I wrote the story, it all came together nicely. And I've always felt that I was actually channeling the story itself. As I said, I never had a moment in which I went completely blank, like I don't know what I'm about to write, or I feel that I'm stuck. It was a very creative process, akin, in my opinion, or in my experience, to a channeling process. I would sit behind the computer and I would just start writing, until I'm tired and I cannot write anymore. Then I would pause and I would come back to it until the next time, and things would just flow like that. Interestingly, things did flow quite well because everything just came together nicely, including the last few chapters that I had never planned would happen in such a way. Of course, one of the pitfalls of not having a structure is that afterwards it took me about 3 passes to review all the content, because there was no harmonization between the content, and every time I was reading something I was like, oop, I need to go and change that back here or back there, and it took me quite a while. So in terms of coming back to the timeline, I started writing the novel in August 2019. I had finished writing it all around May 2020. And I have to, in a way, thank COVID for giving me or allowing me to have a bit more free time in the evenings just to do that faster. Then it took me a very long while to get to a point where I would have the finished version. It actually took me to December 2020. I had to do 3 passes on the book until I had like a storyline, a plot, and everything seemed quite well-rounded. After that, I had to pause because we were moving property, and therefore the focus was on that. Once we had moved property, immediately I looked for a copywriting editor. I found a fantastic person, Victoria, that I will never thank enough for the quality of the work she did with me. I sent her a sample, and this is how it works. You get to send a sample to different copywriters. They will come back to you, do a few light touch edits just to give you a taste or a flavor of how they would like to edit your novel. And they really are the shadow writers of your novel, so to speak. Although shadow writers would not be like the most accurate word or description for them, I would say they are good chameleons in the sense that they improve your writing without changing it. So the way you write, your flow is the same, but it's just like improved to a point that it gets really polished. Victoria was actually very kind. She said, or she commented on the fact that my English was far from being bad, given the fact that I'm not a native person. And you may wonder also, as a quick side note, as to why I decided to write it in English and not in French. The reason is simple. I was living in the UK at the time, and for me as well, there's a much bigger, far-reaching English-speaking audience than a French one. I will do and I'm still doing the translation of the book in French. More of that later. So Victoria did all the copywriting. It takes quite a few months, not too long actually, but essentially, if we agreed to start, I think it was in August 2021, early, I think January 2021, the copywriting was finished. So she would edit it, she would send it to me, I would accept the changes, we would have conversations on things where either she did not fully understand one point I was making, or I would have a comment and would say, well, I'd like to keep that part, how can we best keep it? But essentially, I ended up with the copy written, I don't know if we put it that way, but a version of the book that has been reviewed by a copywriter or a copy editor. The second step to take with the book was to submit it to a proofreader. The proofreader is someone who's really going to review the book as the copywriter did, but with a really, really attentive eye or pair of eyes to the story. So they will notice, and a very basic example would be, if one character has got green eyes and you've changed that in the novel and all of a sudden they've got like blue eyes for whatever reason, they're going to spot that, and they're going to spot any grammatical errors and so on. Because as good as your job you can do with your copy editor, there will always be a few things that you're not going to pay attention to. It's a long job, you have to be very attentive, but of course you're going to miss a couple of things here and there. So the proofreader, he or she, they will really go into a lot of details to make sure, basically they read your story and they make sure the book is really presentable. The proofreader was named Tanya, and again, she was a very, very nice person to work with. She really enjoyed the story too. And I remember as I submitted the novel to several proofreaders, I sent them chapter 15, which is a very short chapter or just a sample of chapter 15, and that is quite pivotal in the novel. And they all came back to me with, we would love to read more of the story or to know more of the story. And one of the proofreaders, whom I did not select in the end, she said, I would love to read your story, it looks so interesting. And a bit of a different flavor to what I normally do too. So it was interesting even at that stage to get some positive comments. Nevertheless, I will be fully honest. This book will never be as good as it is today if it wasn't for people like Victoria and Tanya. So thank you very much, and if you're watching this video, I hope you're not cringing at the fact that it being my first novel, I really followed a really strange way of, or a really strange process when writing the novel itself. And yeah, really starting with no plot, no defined characters, no idea of how I was going to articulate all the chapters together. Yet in the end, we managed to get there, and reading from the few comments I received on the book, they're all very positive about the way the story was written. Another point I want to make about the story is I didn't want the language to be too complicated. I wanted it to be accessible because I'm very aware that the concepts that we are exploring throughout the novel are complex enough in and of themselves to not bar the reader from enjoying the experience. That's why, in my opinion, we've tried to keep it as something that is really easy to read and that can really flow. Someone whom I know who is a very fast reader said he managed to read it in 2 days or 3 days, I can't remember. I was like, gosh, you were just sitting all day going through the pages. And he said, well, it's very easy to read, so actually, I could really go through it pretty quickly. Like, wow, that's impressive. But that person is special because he reads basically 2 to 3 books a week, which to me is massive. If I start a book, I will only read it like in the evening when I've got a bit of time. It would take me like a month maybe just to start and finish one. I like to take my time. I like to really get immersed into the story. Talking about being immersed into the story, I'm getting lost into my own story telling there. So I have to go back to the timeline. So the book, yes, in February 2022 is when I submitted it to Tanya for the proofreading. She got it ready. And basically in March 2022, I was ready to publish. I was thinking about a cover design, and the idea was that, but with different color schemes. What happened then is I moved country by choice, but I moved back to France. And therefore, another move meant that I had to post the book. Changing country is not as easy as moving within the same country, paperwork-wise, tax-wise. Lots of things were happening. So also, moving into a new property and having a few bits to do to it, adjusting to all the paperwork we have to do, or we had to do at the time, meant that I paused the novel for quite a while, or the publication of the novel. And then came April 2024. I was ready to publish. The decision was to self-publish, and it's always been, right from the get-go, this book will be self-published. There's a reason for it, simply because if you go through a publisher, when I had a quick look at going down that route, I felt that it's a complete rip-off. Yes, I appreciate that publishers, they take all the risks, they publish you, and if your book is not a success, basically they end up losing money. Yes, they have to pay people for the marketing, they have to pay people for the PR, they have to pay people for the admin, for the taxes, a lot of different things. Fully appreciate it. But to end up with between 5 and 10% royalties of each book sale you're going to do, or you're going to make, I found it to be quite a bit excessive, because publishers, they do get to live through writers, through people like me, people like you if you're a writer and you're watching this video. I never gelled with that principle. And also, it is very difficult to get through what they call the slush pile, which basically are all the books propositions they receive. And lastly, the financial incentives are not the same as they used to be like a few years ago, many years ago. So I decided to go down the route of self-publishing. Good or bad decision, I cannot tell you. All I know is that I get a better royalty rate by going through Amazon. I've not done like a great job of promoting it on different platforms. I've only put it on Amazon so far. There's a print version, which I'm holding, and there's an ebook. I am working on the French version. I still need to finish the translation, and I would love to do audiobook versions simply because I've got demand for both. So that's something I'll try. Also, as a person, I like to understand how an industry operates. I like to understand how things work. So instead of relying on someone, I like to do things by myself just because I'm very curious. And I can tell you, has it paid off? Well, not really. I've made 32 sales of the book. I was just looking at the stats earlier today. Half of those sales, actually, it's a good 50-50 split, are ebooks, and the other half are print, as this one. 50% of the sales are coming from the UK itself, and then followed by the US and other countries, France, of course. And yeah, so in terms of revenue, it's barely touching €100 in terms of revenue itself. So thankfully, I'm not sort of making or taken the decision that I would leave off the book, because it would have been a very difficult situation. Having said that, I probably would have had more time for the promotional aspects or the promotional side of the novel and so on. And I'm just reading my notes because for once I've taken notes on this video. And of course, one thing I did is, so far I've spent 0 penny on doing marketing. And I know I could spend a bit of money on doing marketing. I probably didn't try to reach the right audience too when I was going through more of a spiritual audience, talking about metaphysical concepts, near-death experiences. I ended up realizing that there are many people who've had NDEs who have also written a book, very often a more serious book, not a novel, to share their experience, which, you know, is absolutely fantastic, because I think it's a great thing that people are sharing the near-death experiences. And there are lots of people who are very curious about that, so I'm not denying that. I just think the market's a bit crowded on that front, and perhaps the audience was not the right one. So not that I'm changing fully strategy, but my idea right now is to try to contact more people who are doing podcasts about, you know, reading books and trying to get a bit more visibility about the novel to audiences that really are readers. And perhaps, yeah, by being in front of those audiences, get a bit more critics. So just trying to have a different strategy to see if I can reach a wider audience. One important point too is I'm not dedicating a lot of time about the promotion of the novel, because I'm quite busy aside from that. But because it's always been a dream of mine, so to speak, or an idea I had when I was quite young, there's one thing about this novel, is that I'm quite passionate about it. So when I find the time to do something about it, I really do it with my heart and my soul, because I truly believe in the content of that novel, and I truly believe that it exists for a reason. There's something fantastic too about having an idea at a very young age. Life goes by, but you never lose track of that idea, or even if you do, it comes back to you at one point in your life, and you are able to manifest it. One thing I love about the paper format is the fact that the first time I was really touching it and receiving it, I was in awe at the fact that something came from my mind, an idea, the inception of a project. And through time, yes, there is effort, yes, there is money involved, because self-publishing means I had to pay with my own pocket money for the copy edition and the proofreading, and even buying those author copies and so on, and distributing some of them to friends and family. But I had always anticipated that it would be the case. But what I'm going with that is, you end up with something that you can touch, and you can say, hey, in my life, I'm not a writer, I'm not a full-time writer, but I've written a book. Also, that gives me a lot more appreciation for everyone who is a full-time writer, because I can appreciate how difficult it is. And the fact that if you're going through a publishing house, you may have deadlines. Whereas I decided that by self-publishing, I would have absolute total freedom about the way I do the promotion, about the pace I have as I write a novel. And also, if I want to write any other novel, I don't want to feel pressured into how I should write them or when I should write them for. It goes against my belief of freedom. Talking about other novels, do I have it in me to write other novels? Well, yes, I do have a few ideas, and as I was writing this very novel, a very specific idea for a second novel came to mind, which I've never lost track of. And then I've had a couple of dreams in which it was suggested to me two very different and funny plots. Of course, you will understand that could not share those plots with you. I don't want to give them away. But I may end up writing those 3 additional novels one day. Then I will probably go about it in a very different manner. The process would be different. I would define the story, I would define the characters, the plot would be defined too, and hopefully the writing will still flow. But this time I won't have to spend months just trying to restructure the story so that it makes sense to you as a reader. There also is the question of finding the time to do so, and right now my focus is really on this specific novel before I even think about writing anything else. So let's finish to translate it to French, because I know there is an appetite from a French audience. Let's do the audio versions, and I do plan to do the audio versions myself, again to learn the process. I was really hesitating with the English version. However, given how many positive comments I do get about, I won't say the quality of my voice, but just the fact that a lot of people do like the way I speak, they find it very calming, I'll give it a go and we'll see how it goes. Actually, I might be very good at actually reading the novel. And the good thing too is because I've written it, I know full well when to put the right intonations, how the story is going to go, or the story is going to unfold. So in a way, I can infuse it with my own energy. That's the idea behind it too. So there you are, How Not to Write a Novel by Vincent Olivier. Hey, it was the first novel I've ever written, at least in this lifetime. If I've written other novels in other lifetimes, perhaps I've not really been that good into tapping into, having a bit more structure and being a bit more processed about doing it. But it also is what happens when you go with the flow and when you are in a truly artistic flow and creative process, you have to go with what comes to you. And the final product, still is decent enough to be presented to a really wide audience. So at the end of the day, yes, I went about it in quite a roundabout way perhaps, and perhaps it was not the most straight road. However, the learning curve in taking that road has been immense. There you are. I hope you enjoyed this bit of a behind the scenes of the novel. If you read the novel, thank you for having taken the time to go through it. If you've enjoyed it, I often say, please leave a comment on Amazon. If you've done so already, I thank you very much for doing so. And if you feel like being supportive about the novel, please share it with people you know, and hopefully we can get a bit more than just 30-something sales of the novel. Not that it matters, I take it very lightly, and at the end of the day, it's more about the experience and the process. And the thing about a book is that it is there, and sales, you never know, they may pick up in 6 months, they may pick up in 6 years, and at that point it is still there. So it doesn't really matter, we've got all the time in the world for it to pick. Thank you very much. Once again, a bit of a long video, but I had to really go through the process and the timeline of all this. What's for the next video? I'm just wondering as I'm concluding this video, what am I going to talk about next? Well, we'll see. I'll come up with something as usual. I will also do the meditation videos and so on. So stay tuned, something will happen. Enjoy your summer wherever you are. And of course, until next time, be conscious, my friends.